If you were waiting for the last minute, it has officially arrived. Registration is closing soon for the next class of FAMM, the Fertility Awareness Mastery Mentorship Program. It teaches you to use the menstrual cycle as a diagnostic tool in your women's health practice. Whether you're a women's health professional with a busy practice or you're in the midst of a professional training program, FAMM is what you've been waiting for. By the time you finish your FAMM certification, you'll have the skills to confidently teach fertility awareness to your clients, interpret all kinds of complex charting scenarios, and you'll have the step-by-step protocols you need to help your clients improve their hormone and menstrual cycle health. We're starting on the 3rd of July. Apply today at fertilityfriday.com/FAMMlive. That's fertilityfriday.com/FAMMlive. This is the Fertility Friday podcast, episode number 528. Today I'm sharing a brand new episode in my FAMM research series, and I'm tackling what I think is a really interesting question. And basically the question is, does stress during the menstrual cycle have a negative impact on your chances of conception? And so the study that I'm looking at is called The Impact of Disturbances in Natural Conception Cycles. So these researchers were actually looking at the menstrual cycles of women who were successful in conceiving and comparing whether or not different disruptions and stressors had a negative impact on their chances of conception. And I find this question to be really interesting because, many of you may be thinking, well, duh, of course it would have a negative impact. I think that we naturally assume that stress would have a negative impact, and we know that stress can have a disruptive effect on the cycle. But what I find interesting about this particular study is these researchers wanted to actually look at the data and determine if this is really having a negative impact and to what extent. And that really helps us to be more confident in those recommendations. And I think this comes from that kind of concern, especially when you're working with women who are trying to conceive. They're often being told all of this information, and we're just kind of taking for granted that it's true. So to what extent do we really have to change our lifestyle, and to what extent do we need to take a step back and to relax and those kinds of things? And when we're being told that we need to do these things, is it really based on sound, solid research? So I appreciate the study for asking that question and kind of going a little bit deeper into it. So one of the interesting things about this study in particular is that they drew their data from a very interesting data set. So the women who are part of this large data set that they have were charting their cycles using the symptothermal method. And therefore, they were gathering a lot of very specific details about their menstrual cycle. And the researchers were able to not only look at the conception cycle, so the cycle of the participants who successfully conceived, but they were able to look at up to 3 previous cycles prior to that conception cycle. And they had a lot of really specific data about what stressors they were experiencing, what events, what things were happening. Again, because the women in this data set were charting in a very specific way. So I think that makes the study unique. And I think it just adds a lot of interesting data and information to this conversation. And I do think that this is one of the reasons that the researchers chose to kind of go about this, because they're wanting to make sure that those recommendations that women are commonly getting are actually warranted. So, what they say as they introduce the study, they say for all couples wishing to have children, it is of great importance to know which factors, so for instance, health, lifestyle, everyday factors like stress, favor or possibly disrupt conception. So they're talking about how women are being given all this advice by their healthcare professionals, but what has actually been researched. And they comment that scientific publications on this particular subject are quite rare. But then there's a whole bunch of advice on the internet that says, do this and do that, and don't do this and don't do that. So what is really kind of an evidence-based suggestion in this case? So obviously from the start, we should say that we do know that severe stressors or medical emergencies or serious illnesses do have a potentially negative impact. And so in this particular study, they're not looking at those extreme cases. They're actually looking at more of the common issues that we face all the time, like having a cold or having some pain or a fever or a variety of different things, even sexual intercourse during the implantation phase in a cycle where conception, takes place. So they're looking at these things in particular, which are more of those everyday things that we all experience, and that even if you think about it, you're more likely to experience in general, just because of how common they are. So in this particular study, a total of 237 subjects were included. And as I mentioned, up to 3 conception cycles were included along with the conception cycle. And so this is potentially the first study and systematic scientific evaluation on this question kind of done this way. What are the impact of disturbances in kind of natural cycles? And I would say one of the reasons that this is potentially one of the very first, if not the first study, is because much of the research is done not on natural spontaneous conception cycles where a couple is trying to conceive and they just get pregnant, but these types of studies are often done on IVF cycles or artificial reproductive technology cycles. So that's something to keep in mind as well, because it applies then to kind of what's happening when you're out, in the wild, so to speak. So interestingly, what the researchers found was that, well, actually, before I go into that, I want to list some of the things that they looked at specifically. So, in the study, they went through the kind of a list of what they were picking up on. And this was based on what the participants in the study were kind of noting, again, in their cycle charts. So they were looking at diseases or pain, so different illnesses around the time of ovulation. So things like common fever, colds, headaches, sore throat, migraines, flu, they said gastrointestinal issues, infections, back pain. So if you think about it, it's just kind of like the run of the mill of just a variety of common complaints or minor illnesses that a person could experience. So they're looking at some of those things to see if they were playing a role. They also looked at ovulatory pain. They looked at stress factors around the time of ovulation. So whether it's work related, like somebody's on call or their sleep is disrupted, or if there was an issue with their home, or if they had to move, or if there was a death in the family, night shift, insomnia, stuff like that. So they were looking at a variety of kind of quote negative stressors. And interestingly, they actually didn't look at what they termed positive stressors, which is something interesting because I often look at that. So an example of a positive stressor would be like your sister's getting married or you're going on a vacation. So they chose only to kind of look at the negative stressors. Like I said, I tend to include all of those things under the category of stress, even if they're so-called positive stressors, but they're looking at this for a different reason. So they were also looking at specific illnesses during the suspected implantation phase. So they were looking specifically at that post-ovulatory part of the menstrual cycle. If someone was experiencing like a fever, cold, sore throat, headache, etc., during that time to see if it had a negative impact, as well as stress during that time and even sexual intercourse during that time. So not only were they looking across the menstrual cycle, or maybe more specifically during the time of ovulation, so they were looking at disturbances during the time of ovulation, they were also looking at disturbances during that kind of post-ovulatory implantation window to see if it would have a negative effect. So again, I love that they had this data set of women who were charting their cycles, because most studies are not necessarily looking to this level to see not only if there was a disturbance during the cycle, but what part of the cycle to see if it could have a specifically negative impact if it happened at a certain time versus a different time. So what is interesting is that the results of the study, like kind of contrary to what you would think, contrary to like, of course you would think, oh, there had to have been a negative effect. They actually found that these types of everyday disturbances did not have a negative impact on the participants that they had looked at. And so they did have a control group. They had participants who did have these disturbances prior to this conception cycle, but they also had participants that did not have these disturbances prior to that conception cycle. And they found that there was not a negative effect. So in these cycles, the stressors did not have a negative impact. And compared to the control group, they found that there were significantly more conception cycles with disturbances than without. So they found that 61% of the kind of disturbed cycle group had those conceptions versus 39% of the control group. So that was, I suppose, just an interesting finding. Ultimately, when they looked at all their data, not only did they not find a negative impact, but they also found a positive one. Now, I wonder why that is. I think that there's part of me that thinks that it potentially just doesn't have these kind of everyday occurrences, may not have the negative impact that we thought. And because they happen so frequently and regularly, it's just one of those things. In many ways, it's like Murphy's Law. Maybe you're more likely to have some sort of disturbance than you're not. Because if we track our cycles and kind of note these things down, every time you have a menstrual cycle, like every month or so, you probably do experience some sort of disruption. And so that's where my mind was going anyways. But I think these results are really interesting because they kind of go against what we have heard. And I had mentioned that they specifically looked at sexual intercourse and stress in the implantation phase. And again, they didn't find a negative result. So that was something interesting as well. They did discuss other research studies that have kind of looked at these questions as well. And they brought up one research study that had found a negative impact of post-ovulatory intercourse on the chances of conception. As a women's health professional, you already know the value of menstrual cycle tracking. But I'm guessing you're not comfortable interpreting complex charts, weird mucus patterns, abnormal bleeding, or other similar situations. You're passionate about fertility awareness and you want to use it in your practice, but you're not quite sure where to start. That's where FAMM comes in. The next class of FAMM is just around the corner. Registration is now open for the Fertility Awareness Mastery Mentorship Program, and classes start in just a few short weeks. By the time you finish your FAMM certification, you'll have the skills to confidently teach fertility awareness to your clients, interpret all kinds of complex charting scenarios, and you'll have the step-by-step protocols you need to help your clients improve their hormone and menstrual cycle health. Transform your practice in 9 months. Apply today at fertilityfriday.com/FAMMlive. That's fertilityfriday.com/FAMMlive. So let's go ahead and jump back into today's episode. But then they also shared a different study that it wasn't a natural cycle, it was an IVF cycle, but they did talk about this other study that had a positive impact, where the couples who had sex in that kind of 2-week wait period after an embryo transfer actually had an increased chance of pregnancy. In this case, the researchers suggested that potentially the additional exposure had a positive immunological reaction. And I'll just read from the study. It says, this has led to appropriate clinical use in the form of intravaginal injection of homologous seminal plasma at the time of oocyte retrieval or embryo transfer. So that's a pretty wordy sentence. But they're saying that because they did this, this research, and they found that this exposure to the partner's seminal fluid had a positive impact on the rate of success after an embryo transfer, that they started doing it as a protocol where they would specifically place the seminal plasma into the vagina as a way to try to trigger this positive immune reaction. And interestingly, the researchers in the study that we're looking at, they suggested that maybe the reason that not only did these stressors not have a negative impact, but they had positive impact based on the results. So given that these stressors seem to be positively correlated with pregnancy, they suggested similarly that maybe they have a positive impact on immune function that increases the chance of pregnancy. So they were kind of making some connections with the potential that part of the reason is that it's kind of strengthening that immune system, immune function, and leading to an increased chance of pregnancy. So lots of interesting things that are put out here. So I guess the question then becomes, what does the study tell us? What does this add? How does this add to our understanding of this whole question that we're looking at today, of how to approach conception. So if you yourself are trying to conceive, or if you're working with clients who are trying to conceive, what does this add to the conversation? So I think that, again, as I said at the beginning, we know that extreme stressors potentially have a negative effect. So this study was looking at more of the everyday stressors, having a cold, a flu, a minor fever, some stomach upset, the kinds of things that most women experience, whether it's during that cycle that they are actively trying to conceive or during that time frame when they're working towards conception. And so I feel like what this study adds to the conversation is that we can have reasonable recommendations and expectations, and we don't have to fear every little thing, because it's really common. If I think about, I know that this is anecdotal, but if I think about my personal life and various friends, family, colleagues, clients, and myself who've been trying to conceive or successfully conceive, obviously we're all human beings and we're living our lives. And so it's really common to, get a cold or feel a little bit sick or under the weather, or these kinds of things. And it just so happens to coincide sometimes with that, when we're trying to conceive or when we've just gotten pregnant or even during that pregnancy. And so I feel like what this study adds to that conversation is that, hey, these researchers looked at this scientifically. It wasn't just a hunch or a thought or something that just makes common sense. And they found that these very common stressors that many of us experience, and again, and common stressors and disruptions. And again, interestingly, they did look at even having sex after in that cycle after you've ovulated, during that implantation phase. So they looked at disruptions potentially around ovulation and disruptions during that implantation phase. And what they found was that it didn't have this overly negative effect. In fact, the researchers were suggesting that it could even have a positive effect. So I think this is good news, a bit of a relief. And it can be really helpful because so many women receive so much conflicting results that can just cause a lot of additional stress and concern. And one of the things that the researchers said, so I'll read the sentence and then maybe chat about it because sometimes the sentences are a bit cumbersome, but what they said was, unfounded statements about possible disturbances in conception cycles can force affected couples into an unnecessary corset of rules of conduct, and above all, significantly increase the sensitivity of stress in those who undergo infertility therapy. So this goes back to why I believe the researchers conducted the study in the first place, which is that they're observing this trend for women who are trying to conceive to be told that they need to kind of follow all these rules and do all these things, and you can't do this, you can't do that. And they're trying to figure out which things are warranted and which things are not warranted. And so I think that it's really interesting and really useful. And I love that they actually took this question and looked at it systematically to provide an evidence-based answer to this question. Again, because the things that they looked at in the study are the things that I would say most women experience, whether it's right at the time of conception or at some point during their pregnancy, or even during the time that they're trying to conceive. And so it's like a relief. We don't have to stress about every little thing that happens, while we still understand that, major stressors, serious medical issues and things could still have a negative impact. But those everyday things and regular disruptions may not have as negative of an effect as we thought. So with that said, I think I'm going to end there. I hope that you enjoyed today's episode. If you did like today's episode and you've been enjoying the podcast, I invite you to head over to Apple Podcasts and leave a review and rating. I do read them and I really appreciate them. It helps other women to find the podcast and to know what we are talking about here and if it's relevant to them. So I would really appreciate that. If you thought this episode was helpful and you think that you can think of someone actually who could benefit from it, the share link is fertilityfriday.com/528. And if you're listening to this episode in real time, this is officially the last call for our Fertility Awareness Mastery Mentorship. We're starting in the first week of July. So head over to fertilityfriday.com/FAMM LIVE, so fertilityfriday.com/FAMM for details if you're wanting to jump in and join us. So with that said, I hope you have a wonderful weekend, whenever you tune into the show. And of course, as always, until next time, be well and happy charting. If you enjoyed today's episode, you are going to love our new resource for women's health professionals, how to interpret virtually any chart your client throws at you. Our new ebook breaks down complex chart interpretation into an easy step-by-step process. Head over to fertilityfriday.com/chart to snag your complimentary copy today. That's fertilityfriday.com/chart.